Are you ready for another front-end question?
Yes, sir.
Tell me how to implement a curried function from scratch, which takes any number of arguments.
Let me try to remember YouTube video on the topic.
Hello everyone and welcome back to my YouTube channel. So today we are going to cover a front-end interview question on function currying. So the interview question is like this, which is how to implement a curried function from scratch which takes any number of arguments. Now before I deep dive into implementation of this from scratch, let's try to understand what function currying is basically. So let's jump into the code and let's just say we have a app.js. So we have a React app setup and within that I have a currying example. So let's just say you want to add three numbers and then in these three numbers you are creating a function for adding those three numbers, which is a, b and c. So what you do is you return those three sum of those three elements as a plus b plus c, and then you write console.log add 1 to 3, let's just say. Now if you go to the browser, you will see that the first log is 6, which is the sum of the functions. Now let's just say you want to divide it into functional blocks. How do you do that? For that you implement function currying. So what is function currying basically? Function currying is a functional programming technique where a function is transformed into a series of functions, each taking a single argument. What do I mean by that? Let's just say I want to split this add function into three sub functions, each function just taking one parameter and returning the value based on what number of parameters are passed. So I have a curried add function which is returning another function, for example, function which is returning b. Then we have another nested function which is taking the parameter c and it is returning the sum of the parameters. So function which has parameter b is returning a function which has parameter a is again returning a function. So this kind of nested functional blocks which allow you to split the curried add function into three levels is called as a curried function. So this is a pretty basic example which might seem complicated rather than doing things directly like this, but there are use cases where curried function is useful. We'll cover that in just the next example. So here what we do is curried add takes the argument a, it returns an internal function which takes a parameter b, which in turn returns an internal function which takes the parameter c, and then we return the sum of these three values as a, b, c. Now if I log this output, which is curried add output, then I should be able to get 6 here as well. So if I go with curried add here and hit save, now if we go back to the browser, as you can see the curried add output is 6 as well. So basically this is how you divide a function into smaller functional blocks. Basically a function which is returning a nested function with the values that can be treated as a curried function. Now what is the practical example of this? So you might have used map, reduce and filter on arrays, right? So all these functions are basically examples of function currying. Let's just say I have three products here like laptop, shirt and phone, and they have a category like electronics, clothing and electronics. Now what I want to do is I want to filter the products by category. For example, I want to get all the products which belong to category electronics and I want to get all the products which belong to category clothing. So what I can do is I can create a function called as filter by category. I can pass a param of category like this, which is electronics and clothing, and I can return a nested function within that. So this is a nested function. It is a single line function, but it is basically a nested function. So you can even modify it using curly brackets and return. But let's just keep it like this. Now what this does is it creates a electronics filter here when we call filter by category, and it returns this nested function. Now when I call this electronics filter on my products function using filter function or the array filter function, and if I pass this electronics filter here, what it will do is it will keep this past category called as electronics into its context, and it will try to see which product.category matches that past category. For example, this first two, the first and third value, they have category electronics, so electronics filter will return these first two values, and then we have clothing filter which will return the second value. Now this is the electronics, this is the clothing, which is using products.filter here. And if I log this clothing and electronics into my console, so let's just keep clothing into clothing category and electronics into electronics. Now if I go back to the browser, so if we come back to the clothing and electronics into the console, you can see that clothing has the product shirt and electronics output has the product laptop and phone which has the category electronics. So this is a practical example where function currying is used. So we can create curried examples like this, and then we can use them within the internal functions to get values. So that is the practical example of function currying. Now, since we are clear about what function currying is, let's try to build it from scratch. So I'm going to comment out the currying example component, and let's jump into currying from scratch component. Now in currying from scratch component, I have an add example function. Let me just comment out this code for a while. Before we jump into the currying implementation, we need to understand one thing, which is function.length. What do I mean by that? So let me just add this into a log statement. So let's just say you have a add example function, which is again like having 3 parameters, and we are returning a plus b plus c. Now what do you think will be the output when I print out add example dot length? Try to guess. Let me just jump into the browser and show you the value. So as you can see, we have the add example and the length that we got is 3. Now how did this happen? Basically, when you write function.length into the browser console, it will return the length of the parameters which are present in the add example. For example, if I go with another parameter here d, and if I go back to the browser, as you can see, now the length is increased to 4. So function.length is basically the number of parameters that the function has into its input block. It doesn't matter whether it is used or not, but if you have passed 4 arguments to the function dot length will return the value as the number of parameters. So this was about the function dot length. Now let's try to use this code into our curried example. Now let's just say I have a curried add function which is like trying to return the sum of 3 values, which is a plus b plus c, and we are passing it to a curried add function like this, and we are using a curry function and we are passing this add function to it. Now how do we convert this simple function into curried function? That's the whole problem. So what we do is we write a function which is curry and we pass it a function. For example, we pass the function as add. Now we try to like console.log the args.length, which is the arguments here, and we try to log the function.length. So if we hit save, and if we go back to the browser, as you can see, the arguments.length is currently 1 because the current argument which is passed to this function is actually the function itself, which is having the length 1, and the function.length, which is the length of the function passed. So basically we have a function passed here, right? And we are returning an internal function called as curried. So curry takes the function add, and we are returning an internal function here called as curried, which is taking the arguments from this function. So what we are doing, so in this case, the function that we passed, if we try to print out the length of parameters in that function, in the function.length, we see that the function.length has the value 3. Why? Because the add function had 3 parameters, and that is why when the function which was passed, now this is taken as a parameter, but internally when we descope the function, we see that the total length of parameters which is passed to this function is 3. Now using this code, what we can do is we can write an if else block, and what we will do is in this if else block is if args.length, which is the arguments.length, is equal to the function.length, then we execute the function, and if it is not, then in the next task function what we can do is we can first like log the next stars, which is the arguments, and then we like return the curried function itself using args and next arguments. So we can also write is like this. So we write next arguments, which is spread out, or yeah, let's just keep it like this, and we are returning curried function. So in this case, what we do is we always try to check whether args.length is greater than equal to function.length. Why? Because let's just say we first, let me just log, comment out this code. Let's just say we pass 3 values to this curried add, which is 2, 3 and 4. And what we are trying to do is we are trying to gauge whether we should execute the function or we should return a curried function, just like what we had here. Like if the argument, if it is the last argument that we have, then we return the sum, but if it is not, then we return the internal function itself. So in this case, this is how the code works. So what we are trying to do here is, in this next args, we are trying to gauge what is the next argument that we pass, and if it's not equal to the function dot length, then we keep on currying the function. Now let's try to understand this into the console.log to understand this better. So initially when args.length is 1 and function.length is 3, the next args value is the value 3, which is passed from here, which is 2, 3, 4. So first of all, when we pass the function, we have the value passed as 2. Then the next argument that we pass is 3. So this is printed out in this next arguments, and we have the value which is 3. Then arguments dot length currently is 2 because we have those two values. Then the function dot length is still 3. Then the value 4 is passed, which is present here. Now arguments dot length is 3 and function dot length is 3. So we execute the function and we return the value 9. So to iterate on this, what we will do is we will log the next argument's value as well as we will log the argument's value. So console.log, and we will write argument's value here as well. So this is the arguments that is passed and this is the next arguments. So let's try to understand this code better now, and we hit refresh. So now let's start from the beginning. Initially we pass the argument or the curry function, which is add. In that case we are just passing this function, right? In that case the args.length which is present at the top is 1 because the first function passed has, and so we are just passing the function, which is why args.length is 1. The parameter length for this function is 3, which is why the value 3 is printed out. Since the args.length, which is currently 1, is not greater than equal to 3, we step into the else block. And what we do in the else block, we take the arguments which are passed in the next function call. So in the next function call, the value 3 is passed here. So first we pass the curried add value 2, then the next pass we pass the value 3. So the argument that we have is 3. So we log those value, which is the value 3, and the argument which was passed previously, which is stored into its context, is 2. So this block, which is args and next args, if you try to log this, what this will do is it will basically spread those two arrays and it will simply write 2 and 3. Now as you can see, let me hit refresh and go to step 2. So as you can see, the values which are passed is 2 and 3. Now this 2 and 3 is then passed back into the function, and then the next parameter comes in, which is 4. Now what we do with this 4, we take that value and we try to analyze whether what is the args.length and function.length. When the value 4 comes in, the arguments array has the values 2 and 3 which were passed previously. The total parameters are 2, 3, 4, which is why args.length now becomes 3, function.length is 3 itself, and then we get into the if block and we execute the function by passing it all the values. And what are those all the values? Let's try to log that as well. So log args in if, hit save, and let's hit refresh. Now in this args in if we have all those three values, which is 2, 3, 4. We take those 2, 3, 4 values and we execute the sum, that is we execute the function itself, which is add abc, and we execute the sum of those values, which is 3. The key thing to note here is, first we try to gauge what is the if condition, and the if condition here is if arguments.length is greater than or equal to function.length. If it holds true, execute the function. Why? Because it specifies that we have reached the end of function call, or the stipulated number of parameters which were required, those are completely passed now. Now if it is not the case, then we simply return a nested function, and in that nested function we pass the parameters which were present from the earlier function passed, and the next function parameters as well. What was the previous arguments passed? In the first pass it was 2, in the second pass it was 2 comma 3, and in the last pass it is 2, 3 and 4. And that combination, when it eventually hits the add function, it executes all those three values and we get the output as 9. Now if we mix it up a little bit, like if we pass first two arguments and then 4, now if we hit refresh, we can see that initially the args.length is 2 because initially we passed those two values, which is 2 comma 3. The function length is again 3, the next, and which is why we return the curried function by passing the value 2 comma 3 and waiting for the next argument. And in the next pass the value 4 is passed, args has the value 2 comma 3. Now again the parameter value becomes 2 3 4. We step into the if block, which is args in if, and in the args in if we have the values 2 3 4 and we execute the value as 9. So you can play around with any number of combinations and it will always return the value 9. So this is how you like convert a function from normal function to a curried function. Now generally when we are using curried function into, let's just say, proper projects, we generally don't implement currying from scratch, but we use libraries like lodash and Ramda.js. Now if you want to use a library like lodash, then what you need to do is you need to install the lodash modular and npm install lodash. Then you need to use the function within lodash, which is _curry. Now this is not the the almost memory optimized way of using this. You can directly import curry from lodash curry instead of like importing the entire lodash library. But for the sake of simplicity, I have just like executed the _curry, and then we can pass the add function just like we passed it in the currying from scratch function, and we can play around with all the possible combinations again. And now let me just like comment out currying from scratch and uncomment lodash Ramda.js and hit refresh. As you can see, the output is again 9. And in this case, we are using the curried function from lodash. If you don't want to use lodash and if you want to use Ramda.js, then in case of Ramda, you can use the r.curry function. So you import star as r from Ramda.js and you like use the r.curry function and it will again give you the same output, which is 9. Now, if you jump into the actual source code of Ramda.js, you will find the curried example. So basically, this is a curry function and it will take the value as internal curry1 and then arity function. And if you jump into the curry1 function, it checks whether arguments.length is equal to 0. If yes, then it will return the function, or else it will return the function with apply, which is similar to how we execute our function itself. It is just a like a little more optimized way of using the function. But basically Ramda.js again like utilizes the similar functional code to implement the function curry. Now, where do we see the use cases of this? Now, if you go to the Ramda.js docs, you will see that most of the function in Ramda.js are curried. So, if you go to the Ramda.js documentation, you will see that most of the function that Ramda.js use. So, parameters in Ramda.js are convenient for currying. It is a curried pro currying usage library, and whatever functions that you see in the documentation, most of them can be used as curried functions. For example, let's just say we are going with add. Now you can use add like 2 comma 3 and you can also use add like add 7 comma 10 as well. So basically all those functions which you can use within the Ramda.js, they support function currying and you can use them to like actually use curried function into your projects. So that was briefly how function currying actually works in, let's just say, industrial level projects or personal projects. And this is how you implement function currying from scratch if it is asked in interviews. Now this is a function which is commonly asked in most of the front-end interview rounds. Like they will either ask you to implement polyfill for call, apply, bind or filter, or map reduce filter, or they will ask polyfill for function currying. So this is how you will implement, or you can implement the polyfill for function currying. So yeah, thank you for watching the video till now. If you found this video useful, then subscribe to my channel and follow for more such content in the future. Have a nice day ahead and goodbye.
Why did the curried function break up? Because it couldn't handle too many arguments. Follow for more such content.